Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Exploring the Textile Exchange Regenerative Agricultural Landscape Analysis Report. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also will be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion throughout the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. Please note the antitrust statement. Textile Exchange convenes the textile community and values diversity of views, expertise, opinions, backgrounds, and experiences. It is expected that members of this community will collaborate by sharing ideas, information, and resources of publicly available information only and avoid discussion on price, strategic plans, or other private and sensitive information. Now on to Beth with Textile Exchange. Beth?
Thank you, Rose. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this encore presentation, going into a bit more detail about our regenerative agriculture landscape analysis that was released on January 31st. My name is Beth Jensen. I'm Director of Climate Plus Strategy at Textile Exchange, and I'm also joined here by my colleague, Sarah Kelly of Common Threads Consulting, who is the lead author on this report. So, due to the time zones, none of our sponsors were able to join us today, unfortunately, but we did want to make sure to have this encore presentation to walk through the same content as we did on the previous webinar that was held several weeks ago now, and then offer an opportunity for all of you to ask questions as well. We'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can today. And you can always feel free to follow up with us afterward if you have additional questions. So in light of the sponsors not being able to attend this call, and again, the sponsors of this report were Caring, Madewell and J. Crew, and Cotton Connect. So as always, we send out a tremendous amount of thanks to them and their support of this project. One of the sponsors from Cotton Connect, Arif Makdoum, wanted to, or sent through just a quick statement that I wanted to read as well, again, since none of our sponsors were able to attend. So he said, one can find anything and everything in this report. It's really a call to action for companies to start investing in pilot projects that are developed in full financial partnership with farmers, indigenous communities, and researchers, generating more data on regenerative agriculture as they go. Making this investment now will benefit soil, nature, and communities, as well as maximizing time for learning and adaptation in the 8 short years remaining before 2030. It is a call for commitments as well. And Arif was an agronomist and a great contributor to this report, along with the other sponsors as well. So just wanted to read that. And I would definitely recommend going back to the recording of the previous webinar and watching really just the first 10 minutes. The rest of the content will be a repeat, but if you watch the first 10 minutes, you'll be able to check in on the comments that came directly from the sponsors as well, if you're interested to hear more directly from them. Okay, but with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll dig into the content here. And as Rose mentioned, there will definitely be time for Q&A as we go along and following the presentation, really. So type in your questions into that questions box, please. Sarah, can you see my screen? Are we looking good? Yes?
Looks good.
Okay, thanks, Rose.
Yeah.
All right, great. So this is us, Sarah and Beth, happy to be with you today. And again, our sponsors of the report. So just for a quick bit of context and framing, as Textile Exchange, we're of course focused on Tier 4 or the scope that we would consider sort of pre-spin. So all of the raw material sourcing and sort of initial production and that stage of the supply chain. And as we have done our modeling, our greenhouse gas impact modeling, on specifically Tier 4, there have really been 3 key pathways that have emerged, or 3 key levers, I would say, to achieving our goal of 45% greenhouse gas impact reduction by 2030. The first The first of these levers is really what we call material substitution. And that's primarily, I think, what Textile Exchange has been known for over the years is helping companies, convert from conventional cotton, for example, to organic cotton or other forms of preferred cotton, from virgin polyester to recycled polyester. Just two of the many examples here. And what we really need in terms of action around this lever is aggressive substitution. So we have all of these known solutions in our portfolio of options today. How can we more aggressively move to substituting conventional or virgin versions of these materials with these more preferred solutions as we seek to accelerate our progress against our 45% target by 2030? The second bucket, or the second lever, is what we call our innovation gap. And that's really where we don't have specific data available today yet to be able to model the specific impact reduction of these different options within this innovation gap. But we know these things are definitely part of the overall solution. So this is where actually regenerative agriculture comes in. I think we have a lot of data so far on, to make it clear that this is the direction we need to go in, and make it clear of all of the interdependent and interconnected benefits of regenerative agriculture, which we'll go into in far more detail here in this presentation. But in terms of the actual sort of mathematical modeling against greenhouse gas targets, a lot of that is yet to be figured out. So that's really why that sits in the innovation gap here. And I think often when we hear the term innovation around these sorts of issues in the industry, our minds immediately go to sort of next gen material solutions. I think that's certainly a piece of it, but we also want to make it clear that circular solutions, sort of textile to textile, recycling innovation, as well as innovative ways of producing materials such as regenerative agriculture are really all part of this bucket as well, and a critical piece of achieving our targets. And then the last piece, which we're not going to go into too much today, but of course is another really important driver here, is just looking at growth rates, and particularly growth rates tied to extraction of new materials to make new products. And so how can we think differently as an industry about value creation? Not saying certainly not saying that businesses have any way to stop sort of creating value for their shareholders and stakeholders. Of course, that's not what we're saying, but how can we start to slow the rates of, again, growth related to extraction of new materials to make new products, and also think about different ways of value creation as well with new business models, and so forth. So these are our three key levers, and it's always just good to provide some framing, I think, of where this regenerative agriculture topic sits within our overall strategy to achieve our 45% greenhouse gas emissions target for the industry. And then just very quickly, a note on our Climate Plus strategy at Textile Exchange. We came up with this a couple of years ago, really to articulate the fact that climate is certainly our North Star. And greenhouse gas impacts, and we know the sense of urgency we face there, and are really committed to enabling the industry to achieve those targets. And while we're doing that, we also can't lose sight of these other interdependent impact areas, such as soil health, biodiversity, and water. And I would also add to this animal welfare and, of course, social impacts and human rights. And so this is our approach at Textile Exchange, just really thinking about climate plus these other areas of impact and making sure we don't lose sight of all of the interconnections here. We also call this pathway Climate Plus because it's so dependent on partnership. So obviously Textile Exchange can't do this alone, and we're going to need partnerships across the industry, both within our industry and across other industries and sectors as well, as we'll talk about a bit more as we go into the report. Oops, sorry about that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to start to walk you through some of the highlights of the report.
Great. Thanks, Beth. And thanks everyone for being with us this evening, this morning, depending on where you're located. Sarah Kelly from Common Threads Consulting. And it's really been a huge honor to have the opportunity to work on this report with Beth and everyone from the amazing Textile Exchange team, all of our project interviewees, expert reviewers, and as Beth mentioned, our project sponsors who made this possible. So thanks so much for being with us. Just picking up on the background that Beth provided, I'd like to give you a quick sense of our goals for the report and I'll walk through our 5 key takeaways in some of our central tools. And then Beth and I will go back and forth a little to share a few of our specific recommendations for companies and ongoing engagement opportunities. So in pulling together this report, we knew that there was a ton of interest in regenerative agriculture across many companies in the apparel sector, and a lot of companies possibly duplicating or doing some of the same research over and over. So our goals here were to map the ecosystem to try to provide a clearer understanding of the tools and programs that are out there and the possible best partnerships for any given company, and to hopefully reduce that duplication of effort and offer a common framework, offering also a concrete pathway for companies to get engaged, and to provide clarity on how that would connect with your existing climate and biodiversity, social justice, and other sustainability targets. So we call this Making Sense of the Swirl, hoping to leave you with this clear pathway forward. But very important to note that we did not expect that we could map every single regenerative agriculture program in existence, and we did not rank or recommend particular programs, but really tried to take that neutral landscape scan approach. So if you could go to the next slide, Beth, thanks. We did that through a combination of interview-driven research and a deep dive into the literature, including both soil science literature and a number of industry reports, both from the apparel industry and from the broader agriculture, food and beverage, and the financing or sort of responsible or sustainable financing areas. That was one of our key emphases. Brought that into this framework that you can see here and with these central tools that I'll say more about in a minute. So if you can go to the next slide, Beth. So our first takeaway is that regenerative agriculture is really fundamental for the apparel and textile industry. This is in the context of the greenhouse gas reduction targets that Beth mentioned, the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, the climate changes that are already occurring, and the risks that need managing. There's so many reasons why this approach is going to be fundamental for the industry moving forward. And a regenerative way of thinking is also part of a transition, as Beth mentioned, to really a fundamentally new economic model for the industry, more just and non-extractive supply chains, and this growing emphasis on degrowth and shifting what we mean by value creation. So if we look at the next slide, excuse me, we tried again to bring this a grounding in the scientific literature. And this diagram comes from a 2019 journal article by Rowe and co-authors from Nature Climate Change. In the yellow kind of pathway part, the yellow band, those are all required emissions cuts to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. The green bar is land sector solutions. And then within the pie chart, you can see that regenerative agriculture in this sort of blue-gray area is one part of the solution, a very important part, but it's also part of this broader group, such as avoidance of deforestation in this kind of green color, bright green color here. So the takeaway that we're really trying to bring forward for companies is we need every tool in the toolbox and every wedge of this pie to meet these goals. Regenerative agriculture has huge promise for a range of benefits, but it's not a singular solution to the climate crisis. And that's part of why it's going to be an element of this really fundamental transformation. And the next slide, thanks, Beth. I think these photos just kind of show you that concept in a little bit different way. On the right, a regenerative rubber production system in Indonesia. But you can see that if that's happening next door or across the border or across the world from the kind of deforestation that we see on the left, we're not really getting the net progress that we need to see. And this reminds us also that regenerative agriculture is relevant for all the major fiber crop categories, including cropping, grazing, and agroforestry. Looking at our second takeaway, next slide, is we heard a lot of interest about the definition of regenerative agriculture. I think there's sort of a strong drive to kind of pin this down or get a handle on it. And we really heard from our interviews and research that we can't try to define this in a single statement or set of practices. It's place-based, it's context-based, and we have to put communities and ecosystems at the core of the work. And the next slide, very closely related, is our strong message that we heard and tried to bring forward, that we have to respect and honor the indigenous roots of regenerative agriculture and acknowledge past and current racial injustices as we move forward, if we hope to see that fundamental transformation in how systems and the industry really work. If you look in the next slide at how we tried to handle this question of what is regenerative agriculture in the report, it was again through this combination of interviews and research. This quote from Karen Washington, a US farmer who also works on a financing vehicle called the Black Farmer Fund, has really stuck with me since I had the chance to talk with her for an earlier report from my colleague Jenny O'Connor. I don't think you could say it really more simply or powerfully than she did. These are indigenous practices and they've been used for centuries or even millennia. Looking at the literature, there was a 2020 review by Newton and co-authors where they looked at 229 either peer-reviewed journal articles or websites from practitioner NGO groups that use the term regenerative agriculture. They broke that all down into the component parts that were included in those definitions and then ranked them by the frequency of use. So these four are the top 4 outcomes that were mentioned in common between those journal articles and practitioner websites. And you can see that social justice is right here in the top 4, along with these sort of ecological elements that are maybe more commonly thought of. And in the next slide, Textile Exchange has pulled that all together into this statement on regenerative agriculture. You can see this in full detail in the report. And we aim to give this as nuanced a treatment as we could and take up some of the key questions that we've been hearing. Next, in the next slide, this is our 4th key takeaway, that regenerative agriculture is about much more than increasing soil carbon levels. We absolutely know that regenerative agriculture can build soil carbon, and that in turn is at the root of many other co-benefits related to biodiversity, both below ground and above ground, water retention, and climate resilience, as well as livelihoods, diversifying income streams. And I think you can almost see that best through photos. So if we look at the next slide, this shows you a couple of the most common practices that are involved or integrated into regenerative systems. On the left, cover cropping in a no-till system, and on the right, alley cropping with pine trees and cotton. And I think you can just get a sense, in addition to building soil carbon, these are helping to create that habitat, foster biodiversity, prevent runoff or erosion, and open up multiple income streams for growers. In the next slide, please. This is true for regenerative grazing systems too, as well as the key benefit of animal welfare that Beth mentioned. And this photo comes from one of our 4 case studies in the report from Shenandoah Wool and Jeannie Carver's group of ranches in Oregon in the US. And in our next slide, a reminder that these benefits also include supporting Indigenous livelihoods, really putting Indigenous leadership at the center, here with a project involving food and fiber, food and cotton rotations with Indigenous families in Bolivia. We did note in our slide here that because of a shifting consensus in the soil science community around the specific mechanism of long-term carbon storage, we're having to rethink some of the mathematical assumptions that underpin the models that are used to predict exactly how much carbon could be stored through regenerative agriculture and for how long. So for that reason, we recommend that companies proceed with due diligence around claims related to carbon sequestration, specific amounts of carbon, and around carbon credits and markets. Again, this doesn't change the critical co-benefits of holistic regenerative systems. And I think this graphic gives you a great sense of that. In order to move to this sustainability transition or the climate transition, we really have to keep in mind that these are interrelated benefits and not have what they call carbon tunnel vision. So that is our 4th takeaway. And here is our 5th, our last. Super important for the apparel industry to be working across silos, especially with the food and beverage sector, but with multiple industries to speed up the transition to regenerative ag. There's a huge amount of activity going on in the food world as well, the equally busy swirl, and so much opportunity for the apparel industry, not just to learn from that, but I think really to influence policy, research initiatives, the kinds of technical assistance that are available, and financing models as well. One concrete way to think about that in the next slide is that many of the crop rotations recommended in regenerative systems include both food and fiber. Here you can see a cotton, maize, sesame, and bean rotation. And in our case study number 1 from J. Crew and Madewell, we include their description of a cotton, sorghum, peanut, and sunflower rotation. So right away, you can see we're going to need joint marketing, joint technical assistance, extension agents who understand food and fiber, and really to have the whole conversation be in that term of food and fiber. So next is just a quick recap for you to have in the slide deck of the 5 takeaways, hopefully giving you a sense quickly of some of the main messages that we really hope to bring forward for the apparel industry overall. Let's take a quick look at some of our central tools that we use to structure the report and hopefully create that clear pathway forward. As Arif mentioned in his statement at the beginning, we hope that our report really is a call to action for companies to engage and start investing now in pilot projects, pilot regenerative agriculture projects that are developed in full financial partnership with farmers, ranchers, Indigenous communities, with researchers, so that we can learn and develop together the kinds of understanding that we need in that short 8-year window. We know that it takes 1, 2, or even 3 years to really get an agricultural system established and start seeing the outcomes and benefits. So we're encouraging companies not to necessarily wait until we have perfect clarity on everything about industry guidance, everything about the soil science. We need to start now and do that learning together in partnership with growers. So breaking that down just a little, our first step might seem kind of obvious, but companies have the opportunity first to really identify their core priorities, whether that's a crop that is the main driver of impacts, whether it's the largest volume crop, whether it's one that you have concerns about resilience or risk, and same for the countries or regions that you might want to focus on. Where do you have partners that are interested, or where do you feel like you really need to understand resilience in your system? And that is combined with the kinds of guidance and target setting that's coming out from industry processes like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We included an appendix to try to capture like a snapshot in time of those processes, but even since our report came out, those are already evolving as well with new guidance that's relevant for regenerative ag. So we'll have to see that as something that's just an evolving space for companies to continue identifying. In the second step, we heard a lot about the key role of project developers and the real importance of finding project developer partners who have trusted relationships in on-the-ground communities. So we have a section of the matrix dedicated to that group, and this map as well to try to identify some of the key geographies and some gaps as well. The matrix, which I'll say more about in a second, was our effort to really break this landscape down into chunks that companies could consider in turn. So it covers standards and certifications, the underlying farm level accounting tools, scientific research institutes, partners who could provide outreach, education, or other kinds of services. In the fourth step, these underlying farm level accounting tools, such as perhaps Comet Farm or a Cool Farm tool that you might be familiar with, we note that although brands might not be the ones to directly engage with these, it's super important for companies to have staff or contracted partners in their teams who can understand the science and the sets of assumptions that underlie these in order to make accurate claims. In step 5, we emphasize the key importance of developing a specific financial model for the project upfront that shares the risk of that transition to regenerative agriculture with growers. We do that through a number of concrete models for maybe more familiar revenue opportunities like a CSR budget or company foundation. And we bring forward a lot of creative and innovative financing models using loans, loan guarantees, investments of multiple types, and models from both the apparel industry and the food and agriculture industry as well. And if carbon credits are sought, there are 2 recent reviews from EDF and Carbon Plan that are quite robust and give you a chance to sort of compare the tools that are available right now. And our arrow here just indicates that this is a learning loop, an iterative process where we need many pilots in many geographies, again, because of that place-based and context-based nature of regenerative agriculture. So in the next slide, thanks, Beth. Here's a little closer look at our matrix. This goes on for a whole nother page and then several more pages of other brand partnerships and connections that we wanted to highlight. It was a central goal for the project to map this landscape against a common framework, probably one of our most challenging efforts to figure that out. So we've broken this down again in chunks that correspond to the steps of the pathway. And then across the top, we have these categories and these major groups that include which agricultural system does this tool pertain to? What are some of the major functions or the type of initiative? What are some of the regenerative agriculture indicators that are covered by the program? And some other roles and functions such as pilot projects that might be covered. Just a couple quick notes. For project developers, we use this star to indicate it depends on the project, the partner, the brand, the geography. And we made a very initial attempt to, again, it's like a snapshot in time of the companies or the programs and tools that are trying to move to outcome-based standards. This is another place of very rapidly evolving work that we know will continue as many programs are working to move in that outcome-based direction. In our last tool is this map, which again, we tried to show just a snapshot of what sample pilot projects and project developers, where they're based, some of the projects on the ground, and you can see where there's some pretty major gaps on the landscape in key production regions, where it would be great to learn more about regenerative systems through new pilots. So that is a very, very fast overview of our central takeaways and tools, and we're glad again to try to answer more questions. I'll give it back to Beth to share some of our recommendations, and I'll pick a few things back up in a minute.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So 7 recommendations for brands here that came out of our research and just compilation of all of the different sources and voices that we heard as we put together this report. The first one is really to bear in mind that the topic of regenerative agriculture should really be approached as an investment in a fundamentally different system versus sort of an add-on or an incremental improvement to the current, primarily quite extractive focused system. So really looking at it through that lens and sort of working within your teams, brands teams, to promote this point of view. Really, it's really a call to action for companies to invest in these real, on the ground partnerships with farmers and Indigenous communities, as well as researchers who can provide the technical expertise to make sure that programs are robust and sort of headed in the right direction in line with the current thinking in science. The second recommendation is really honing in on that piece about the importance of centering these efforts in the stewards, the farmers and growers who are really the active decision makers on the land, working on the land on a daily basis, making sure that programs are really in equal partnership with these folks. And also in particular, prioritizing justice and equity, involving the Indigenous people, communities of color, or farmers, or whoever farmers and growers may choose to have participating in these types of programs as their representatives, just making sure that those voices are really grounded and are really looked to from the very beginning of developing any partnerships. This is just a great photo from one of our case studies from Oshadi. So thanks to them for providing some of these great images. Third recommendation is really the point that it may not be that you need to develop an entirely new supply chain or supply network to establish regenerative agriculture programs. We encourage brands to look within your existing supply networks and start to identify partners who may potentially want to go on this journey with you. So, it's this opportunity to really fundamentally rethink how sourcing models are built, and start to engage in direct connectivity across the supply chain, farmers and growers, all the way through to brands and every step in between, and really align around sort of a shared vision and direction of travel, which is really what regenerative agriculture is all about. And so, again, using it as an opportunity to really invest in those direct farm level partnerships, and making sure that that's really kind of a central focus of any programs. Fourth recommendation, I think Sarah touched on this a bit earlier, is just the importance of scientific and technical capacity here. So making sure that companies are really looking at their staffing structures to engage these folks, these real technical experts in these programs. So whether that's an in-house position or whether you consult with somebody, there are many experts out there. This is a rapidly evolving field that gets quite technical very quickly. Just making sure that any efforts are really grounded in the latest science and really ground truth in that way as you move ahead. Another great photo from Oshadi. Another point that we heard quite a bit from our interviewees as part of this project was the thought that we don't need a proliferation of new standards or certifications to emerge trying to define what regenerative is or is not. The feeling was that was really not the right approach, and we would agree with that. I think the feeling is this type of, again, direction of travel should really be built in to existing certifications and standards, the many existing certifications and standards that are out there. So how can we start to evolve what's already out there to more accurately sort of capture, outcome measurements that are linked to practices, capture the capacity building that needs to happen to build truly regenerative systems. It's not an either or, it's not a black or white, this is or is not regenerative. It's a pathway, it's a continuum, again, a direction of travel. So how can we start to accomplish that through the many existing platforms for certifications and standards that are out there is what we would recommend. And Textile Exchange is doing this as part of our update to our standards. And you can find more about this on the Textile Exchange Hub in the standards section. But really looking to, again, as we evolve our standards, how can we more directly link practices to positive outcomes and outcome measurements and that type of thing. And I will turn it back over to Sarah here to talk about the last two recommendations.
Great, thank you, Beth. So we've again touched on some of these, but our sixth recommendation is around this need for innovative financing and just and equitable financing from the very start of a project. Long-term contracts are sort of a minimum that's really needed to help growers be willing to undertake this transition. That's something we heard again from interviews and research. And there are also multiple ways that companies can help support pilots and the kinds of research that are needed. Some of them internal, such as marketing, CSR and operations, the charitable wing of a foundation, programs like the Impact Incentives program that Textile Exchange has been involved in developing. And as I mentioned, a whole range of creative models that we have in a table with links for you to explore and see if there are some that really resonate with the kinds of programs that you might have in mind. And that could involve taking models from the agriculture and food industry, as well as what's already been done by innovative companies in the apparel space. The next slide, please. This quote, I think, really sums it up from a recent report by New Economics Foundation and Croatan Institute. We got where we are. We got the systems that we have now, and this sort of extractive approach that Beth mentioned, because of the way that financing is set up and because of the kind of incentivizing that happens. So we have to reimagine and re-envision that whole underlying structure if we want to see this fundamental transformation. Our seventh recommendation, I think we have mentioned to you as well, increasing information sharing with the food and beverage sector. We've had the chance actually for a couple recent conversations about all the ways that can happen. And I know this is something Textile Exchange will be taking leadership on, being part of conversations that cross the sectors. We know in the next slide that these ecological systems don't differentiate between food and fiber. So we need to have that moving out of silos and having a holistic approach as well. In our next slide, really encourage you to look into the report in detail for the 4 case studies. The companies and businesses profiled here were very generous with sharing information about their journey, some of the challenges and hurdles, their financing models, the way they've put these projects together. So we've got one from J. Crew and Madewell and 5 Lot Cotton on Texas cotton, one from VF Corporation in Timberland with Terra Genesis on rubber in Thailand, one from Oshadi in India on their regenerative farm in cotton, and one from Shaniko Wool in the US state of Oregon on wool and regenerative ranching. So do please take a look at all that they've shared with you there. And just wrapping up, I think, again, we have a lot of other great quotes in the report from our generous interviewees and just the wisdom they shared. But I think this one really seemed to me to sum it up from a participant in the Forum for the Future process. This is a systemic issue, and we have to have systemic approach to the kind of transition that we're seeking. So back over to you, Beth, for some next steps.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Yep. And so just to tee up some engagement opportunities that we have through Textile Exchange as next steps coming out of this report. We are building what we're calling a regenerative agriculture community of practice, and that will include a few different, pull together a few different initiatives. One thing we're doing is really scoping out what we're calling tentatively a regenerative agriculture action cohort. So that would really be helping convene the industry and convene funding to some of those structural projects that will help scale this movement. And scale this movement in a thoughtful way, I should say. It's not necessarily going to be designed to invest in and or directly manage specific on the ground programs, but more what are sort of those broader structural needs that no one company can really address alone as part of our collective effort to really grow this movement. So more to come on this. We're really scoping out kind of the clear engagement pathway there now. We also encourage you to come to us with any ideas you have about phase 2 regenerative agriculture research needs. So building on this landscape analysis report, we are already exploring some different options for, what are some other topics to deep dive into, whether it's something that was covered in a more cursory way in this report, or whether it's something, we weren't able to cover in this report. If you have any ideas or suggestions on this or things you really need, we'd love to hear them. And then, of course, we have our fiber and materials roundtables that have been running for many years, some of these for many years. And regenerative agriculture will really be a cross-cutting topic throughout these, and these roundtables will be part of what we're calling this overall regenerative ag community of practice. So you can see the different options there. All of this is available for members on the hub, the Textile Exchange hub. So please head over there if you would like to get linked in with any of these efforts. And we are happy to help you get set up with that if you need. And email addresses for both Sarah and myself are at the bottom of this screen. And I think that's all we have. So yes, we're at the Q&A portion. I'm probably going to just stop my share here. And let's take a look and see if we have any questions. Oops.
Yeah, we have a couple of great questions coming in, Beth, and please, everyone, do put your questions. I'm saying in the Q&A box because that gets saved with the recording, so it's just a little bit easier for us to hold on to them if we're not able to answer them, and then we can answer them in writing, which we've been doing on the hub. But feel free, if you have comments or just anything you want to share with the whole group, feel free to put that in the chat, and something that you'd want preserved in the Q&A box, we'll make sure to be able to hold on to it. So first question coming in from Alexandria Bayer, hope I'm saying your name correctly. Is native plant restoration highlighted in our strategy recommendations and our communications about regenerative agriculture? I'll take a quick shot at that, Beth, and jump in if you have thoughts.
Yep, great.
Because of our really strong emphasis on the place-based and context-based nature of regenerative agriculture, we didn't end up in this report actually talking very specifically about certain practices that would or would not apply in various areas. I think we felt like we wanted this to be as relevant as possible for multiple users. I would say that native plant restoration absolutely could be part of regenerative systems, and a healthy, flourishing native ecosystem is going to be part of like the climate solution and resilience overall. I think it might depend on the system, again, whether that was like the first priority, depending on the condition of the soil or what the growers' priorities were. Maybe it's water retention and they want to work on cover cropping first because that's really the number one thing they're seeing as a barrier. So not to be wishy-washy, but I think this is really going to depend on the priorities of those communities on the ground in the area, but obviously moving towards those resilient native systems would be a goal.
Yep.
Anything you want to?
Yep. Nope. Nothing to add on that. I think that's great. Great example of, a practice that is generally considered as this overall potential portfolio of solutions within regenerative ag, but which solutions are specifically going to be applicable to which ecosystems is very obviously place and context specific. So don't want to. Unfortunately, not as black and white, but that's the beauty of it as well, and what we all, I think, need to start shifting the mindset to. Great. Yep.
Maybe you can take this next one, Beth. I think this is something Textile Exchange has worked on so much. From Eileen Liu, hope I've said that correctly.
Yeah. Has
traceability been considered as part of this great report? Thank you. And how would you recommend that companies trace regeneratively produced fibers to provide assurance to their consumers?
Yes, this is a great question. So yes, certainly considered. And I think this is really an emerging area. So I'm going to sort of answer this a couple of different ways. One is that we have to be careful about basically what I was just saying in the previous answer. We have to be careful about trying to assign a black or white, this is or is not regenerative agriculture type of line, and that is, I think, much of what we have, the approach we have taken with previous standards, just as a collective industry, is this is or is not, X, Y, or Z. So I think we need to be careful about that mindset here and not fall into the same sort of challenges that we've fallen into with some of the other sort of standards efforts around, perhaps things being reduced through government legislation, for example, around organic, and sometimes being reduced to more of a lowest common denominator type of thing, and sort of diluting the original intent of the organic movement in many cases. And so all that to say, with that in mind, there are many programs out there that are really working on this, and again, sort of building in this regenerative pathway into existing standards and certifications, which is again one of our key recommendations. I'll just give you one example from the Textile Exchange perspective. We are spearhead a number of standards for the industry, preferred material standards for the industry, and again, as we're looking at evolving our standards, and making sure they're really continuing to be sort of leading edge. One of the things that we're really working on is embedding a clearer link between practices and then outcomes. So, and making sure that that is done in such a way that it really is context specific versus, again, regenerative agriculture is not just a single checklist of practices. So bit of a long-winded answer, but all that to say, yes, traceability was certainly included in our thought process, and you'll be seeing more to come on this, I think, from, a number of players in the industry in the foreseeable future. But I guess the last thing I would say on this is just, again, one of our key recommendations is really to use this as an opportunity to directly engage with your farmers and growers in tier 4 wherever possible. So yes, you need to make sure that there's chain of custody and traceability through the supply chain. And there are a number of different, mechanisms that are either in place now or developing to be able to do that. But ultimately, a lot of this comes down to establishing those closer relationships with tier 4, as well as longer term relationships between brands and their tier 4 suppliers. And that may be at an aggregate sort of farm group or supply shed level. And that's okay. For a lot of larger brands, it's not realistic to be able to engage with every single one of the individual farmers and producers. But somehow getting more direct linkages to that tier 4 is really what we're encouraging here, regardless of the size of your company, and developing those long-term relationships to really de-risk this for the farmers and growers on the ground. So hopefully that covers that.
Right.
Great. Let's see.
I can tackle this next one from Paula
Great.
Rogers, because I'm afraid this was something I was supposed to say and forgot, although I now cannot remember whether I said it or not. So Paula asks, when you discuss regenerative agriculture, the framework spoke of soil health, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and social justice, but not water systems. Why were these not included in the framework? So I was supposed to, if I did not, say that although water was not in the top 4 of those outcomes when everything was ranked in the Newton and co-authors journal article, it's absolutely so closely connected to biodiversity and soil health that it really is part of the mix, as you see in Textile Exchange's Climate Plus framework.
Yes.
I think it just wasn't maybe something that was always made part of the definition of what's different or what's characteristic for regenerative agriculture. And that's why when the ranking was done, it wasn't right there in the top 4, but certainly part of the connections. So thanks for the question.
Yeah. And I can take the next one from Manami Suzuki. And this is one of the most commonly asked questions that we get. How do our organic and regenerative fit together, essentially? Does regenerative cotton need to be organic, or does it not need to be organic? And here's how we would answer that. First of all, I direct you to the section in the report where we spent a great deal of time really thinking through how to articulate this and articulate kind of a clear point of view on this to the industry, with great help from Sarah Compson, one of our colleagues internally as well, who's really well embedded in the sort of soil and organic point of view. And where we've sort of landed on this, there are a couple of key points to consider here. First of all, one of the initial questions to ask is, when you're referencing organic, are you referencing the organic standards as we know them today, or are you referencing the broader organic movement? And those are two very different things, I think, because if we talk about the broader organic movement, that's really essentially on the same, it's essentially the same thing, right? The regenerative movement and the organic movement overall are really moving in the same direction of travel. Now, if you're asking about specific organic legislated practices against the breadth of things we could consider regenerative, that's a different discussion. So the first thing to really think about is again, this distinction between organic as it's been perhaps codified in legislation versus the broader concept of organic. And so what we would say is we need an all of the above approach. It's not either or. There's not a clear distinction of what's in and what's out for each one of these. Again, it's really a continuum of practice. It's along a pathway. And we're all trying to get to areas where, again, as we put in our sort of working definition, I would say, and that's included in the report as well, it's really getting to a place where the use of synthetic fertilizers is fertilizers and pesticides is that is really minimized as much as possible and ideally eliminated. But again, that's going to be along a pathway, right? Because then if you're also doing limited till or no till, those things are interdependent as well. And so then, it's just really looking at each individual production system and each individual geographic region and what makes sense to sort of work along that continuum within each specific situation. So that's how I would answer that to start. But again, I would definitely recommend that you review that section as well as the section on where we've treated the conversation around a definition. And again, I want to be clear, there's no sort of one line definition for regenerative agriculture, but we have a good section where we've talked about this as well and what we consider as part of this direction of travel. So Sarah, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to any of that.
No, I think that's great. Thanks for sharing that context. And yeah, I want to appreciate Sarah Thompson for her contributions. And it wasn't something that we could just boil down into a soundbite. So hope that you'll review the treatment that we have in the report. Yeah. So I can try the next one from Charles Ross, which is a great question that I think is really fascinating. As someone with a soil science nerd background, I will own. Regenerative agriculture is seen as more the return to the practice of mixed farming from a century ago, before the development of additive chemicals to the farming process. What modern applications are added to this traditional technique? So what I think is fascinating about this is that many of the places where we're seeing the modern techniques come in are in monitoring, analysis, our ability to really examine and see exactly what is going on in the soil on a microscopic level, as well as with soil microbes and their kind of environment. And what we see from this is really a reaffirmation and almost like a full circle round to the kinds of traditional practices that you referred to, Charles, and also older, even more traditional practices from Indigenous communities. One of my very favorite diagrams in the report, which we didn't put in our slides, is on page 30. And it comes from a couple of Cornell soil scientists who've been part of this kind of reassessing our knowledge of exactly what's happening in the soil microenvironment. But what they essentially conclude is that so many of the practices that have traditionally been involved, like cover cropping and reducing tillage and planting mixed species, have been essentially affirmed by our modern and new soil science analytical techniques. And they summarize it by saying that all this recent science is showing us that we need to have an approach of what they call constant care to our soils and our soil management. And I think, again, this just really brings you full circle around to the input that we heard from Indigenous speakers, Native speakers, about how they see their relationship to the land. There's not a new place to just go to when things are degraded. And so there's this emphasis on care and constantly having this reciprocal relationship. So there are certainly new tools that have been applied to regenerative agriculture, like precision ag, where you can know exactly how much cover crop seed or how much of a certain amendment to apply to a certain field. And there are many elements like that have been brought in. But I think the core of our modern techniques has really been to help us just understand better what's happening beneath the soil. Thanks for the question.
Great question.
And we've got one more question.
Yeah, one more. What is the threshold for using the term regenerative ag? And again, I think this goes a bit back to what we were discussing earlier, which is I would really caution us against trying to establish an in and out threshold. This is about a continuum of practice. I know that's not an easy answer in an industry where, we've all been conditioned to, say this is certified or not, or this is, it's much more black and white typically, but I think we need to start to think about how we can live in this world in which things aren't necessarily as black and white, and that's okay. Natural systems aren't black and white. And so all I would say on this is that, again, I think there will be more clarity to come on this once some additional work has been done that's already been started by a number of parties in the industry around really how can we make sure that the practices that we're encouraging are linking to the positive outcomes, and what do positive outcomes look like in individual production systems or geographies, which that will vary greatly as well. Sort of, what is a good threshold of outcome, and then what is a good progress to be made against that threshold. That's going to vary by place and by production system. So all that to say, can't answer that question right now, and hopefully we're all okay with that. But also, we hope that the regenerative landscape analysis report provides a good deal of backstory or background around the context of why that question isn't necessarily the easiest one to answer right now. Again, the last thing I would say on this is just to reference our treatment of sort of what is a working definition of regenerative agriculture as well. And again, we're being very careful to not say exactly what's in and out, but certainly there's I hate to keep using the term direction of travel, but truly that's what it is some core principles that you want to try to work toward in this area, and work toward collaboratively with all of the partners across the value chain. So thanks for the question.
Yeah.
And another one, how accurately can we measure the amount of carbon sequestered through regenerative ag practices? Are there standout examples? So this is exactly what I was referencing in one of the very initial slides there, where I showed the greenhouse gas modeling for the broader industry toward our 45% greenhouse gas reduction target. There is guidance on this coming out, expected to come out from the greenhouse gas protocol in late 2022. So we're looking out for that, but for the time being, there is not a really formalized methodology for measuring what we call carbon removals through carbon sequestration. So one of another key takeaway in the report as well is really, let's not forget about all of the reduction opportunities at the farm level as well. So things like reducing the amount of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, that's one of the major drivers of GHG emissions, is the production of those things. So how can we reduce those inputs, and again, get production systems to work more in harmony with nature? Use less of those inputs, or ideally eliminate them altogether. That's one great thing to do. And then, looking at some of the machinery that's used at the farm level as well. That's another driver of GHG emissions. There are many other reduction opportunities in addition to removals for via sequestration, which is a bit more challenging to account for right now. Again, the greenhouse gas protocol, which is really the kind of go-to resource for providing a standardized methodology and how to account for these things, is working on this. So more to come on that. I think that's it. All right. And we're just about at time. So yeah, I guess let's wrap up. Feel free to reach out with any other questions. Thanks again for your attention today and for all the great questions. Hopefully we satisfactorily answered anything you had in mind, but yeah, looking forward to continuing to serve the industry and guidance in this area. And again, feel free to reach out if you want to get involved in any of the engagement opportunities that we shared in the last slides there. So thanks for your time and attention.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. Please note the link in the chat to the hub where you can join in conversation and continue to ask questions. As a friendly reminder, an email will be sent to all registered participants with a link to today's presentation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.